Hey everybody, welcome to episode 90 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can connect with the show on Twitter by following us at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to dive into a really interesting case of data journalism, and I'm going to be speaking with Neal Rothschild. He is the Associate Director for Growth at Axios, which is a media organization you may remember from episode 50. So Neal works with the social media accounts of Axios in terms of audience growth, but he's also spearheading a project called the Axios NewsWhip 2020 Attention Tracker, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. The Attention Tracker is a partnership between Axios and NewsWhip, which is a social media engagement monitoring firm that tracks news stories and the attention that they get on social media. So they have a domain list of 450,000 media organizations, both traditional established media, but also more fringe alternative outlets, and they track the amount of engagement that stories published by these outlets get on Facebook in terms of reactions, comments, and shares, but also Twitter retweets from a list of 300,000 influential Twitter users. That's things like media outlets, journalists, and public personalities. So what Axios is doing with this technology is every week they are monitoring both mentions of the 2020 Democratic candidates and also issues that are prominent in the public debate, things like immigration, guns, healthcare, foreign policy. And so every week they look at these candidate and issue engagement rates and try to interpret them as, let's say Joe Biden makes a gaffe and there's more attention in the social media ecosystem around that. And I think it's an interesting way to source journalism from social media and also interpret what's going on in the online world around the 2020 Democratic primary. So in this episode, we're going to dive into the nuts and bolts of the attention tracker, get Neal's take on what's valuable about it, maybe what are some of its limitations, and then digging a bit into what the attention tracker has actually found, which is fun because we talk a lot about recent issues around the 2020 Democratic primaries. So definitely an American-focused episode, fun to kind of talk politics with someone who's reporting about it. And we recorded this actually at Axios' headquarters in Washington, D.C., in their podcast studio. So that was a lot of fun. And thanks to Sam Gentile for doing all the tech work behind that. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Neal Rothschild, Associate Director of Growth at Axios. Neal, thanks so much for taking the time out. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
I am very excited to do this, Michael.
So I'm also excited to take a deep dive into the 2020 Attention Tracker. But first, can you describe for us the type of work you're doing here at Axios?
Yeah, so going into this election cycle, what we wanted to do was, in 2016, I think a lot of people had the reaction of Trump win, how did this happen? But I think it starts to become more clear when you go outside of your own social media feeds. Obviously, filter bubbles are something people are well aware of. You cater your own social media feeds to what you are interested in and the topics you agree with generally, or stuff that is palatable to you. But I think what people didn't see a lot in 2016 was just how much enthusiasm there was for Trump and for his ideas that plays out on social media that just doesn't make it onto their feeds. So if we can break out beyond your individual feeds and kind of figure out a way to quantify the universe of social media as it pertains to 2020 and different candidates and different topics, that'll be a really important way to look at the election. So how far stories about immigration going compared to, in this year, universal basic income or canceling student debt. So then if we can then, quantify this and put it into a nifty little chart that people could read regularly, that'll be a new way for people to understand the election aside from just fundraising and polling, which are, useful and important measures, but, they only get to certain aspects of it rather than, building out a more comprehensive picture that includes enthusiasm, right? If people are sharing things on social media, that's a very enthusiastic indicator that, you share things when you're fired up and hell yeah, I agree with that, or hell no, this is stupid. that, if you're polled, whether you have strong opinions or not, you'll give an answer and it kind of gets put into your for Hillary or Trump or whatever it is. But that's not necessarily the best way of, predicting turnout, because you might answer Hillary, but if you're not that interested, it might not lead to you turning out to vote.
Right. And I want to get to some of those differences between the kind of attention and traditional polling and fundraising a bit later on. But I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting about the tracker is you have, on the one hand, you're measuring candidate attention, and on the other, there's issue attention. And I want to kind of parse that apart. But taking candidate attention first, I mean, why do you think that's particularly important in this media environment, social media context, digital age, quote unquote, looking at candidate attention, particularly in this election cycle?
It's particularly important for the Democratic primary. You originally had something like 25 candidates declaring that they were running. So how do you begin to sift that out? Obviously, there's polls. And like I mentioned, those are important. And that tells you a story. But, is there traction going on beneath the surface that, might not make it onto your feeds, but shows a true enthusiasm for what's going on? So a good example was Pete Buttigieg. It was about in March and early April. He really started to surge and take off in popularity, and he started to get fundraising rolling in. And kind of it was after that started that his polling began to rise. So it was a good leading indicator that, there's interest in him. People like what he's saying. And there's a way to quantify that. How many stories about him? How far did they go? How are people receiving it? And one thing that was, interesting for me, my job here, I report on these storylines and capturing attention, but I also run our social media channels that if you post an article about certain topics or certain people, you can see the reach and how much engagement they get. Stories we were posting about Buttigieg were taking off. So being able to see inside of the machine, what's really going on here, you see that the reach for articles about him are 50,000 reach or 60,000 reach compared to other candidates might be 20,000, less than that. So for me, that was a really interesting tell that there is enthusiasm around this guy. That has since dipped off. That very much was a plateau for him. But I'm sure it will come into play later in the election with other people and other issues.
Right. So just to kind of recap that, what you're saying is that you've been looking at the attention tracker, seeing Buttigieg rising in popularity, and then as you're working with the Axios social media accounts, articles about Buttigieg were sort of going along with the attention tracker.
Exactly. And that's kind of how I got interested in this idea in the first place, is that, it's part of our jobs, our distribution strategy. Part of that is social media, post Axios articles and try to build our audience. And it's fascinating to see, what are the items that are getting attention, that are getting interest. But instead of just using these observations for, Axios, what story should we be writing? What is our audience really responding to? Kind of using that same data, quantifying social media to, if I'm just a regular politics consumer, I'd be interested in that. How are people really responding to this stuff? So I thought it'd be important to bring that data and, turn it into journalism rather than just internal metrics.
And so does that in any way, the insights from the tracker, I mean, are you using that in how you're deciding to, I don't know if framing's the right word, but how you're constructing headlines or the images that you're using? Are you sort of drawing on what you're seeing from the attention tracker in order to maybe boost your reach on social?
I think they're a little different. Certainly we take all of those observations in, but our audience is different than kind of the whole of the audience that we're reading. The fans that liked Axios's Facebook page, for instance, they were probably, because we were founded by the founders of Politico, and that's how we got our initial traction, maybe a core group of, fans of Politico and political journalism. And it's kind of ballooned out from there. That is specific to our audience, and the insights that we get from stories we post about different candidates will reflect that population, but it'll be different for whether you're talking about the New York Times audience or the Economist article or Times. There'll be a different kind of set of, different interest in politics, different political leanings. So it all factors into our understanding, but I didn't want to use Axios's own data for the tracker, just because it's so specific to us, and I more wanted to cast a much wider net as far as, not just one publisher, but it's a couple 100,000 domains that we're tracking as far as articles published.
Right. And I want to dive into those because I think it's important to talk about what the tracker does and then doesn't do. But first, keeping on the content, you have on the one hand the candidates, but then you're also tracking keywords around a variety of like hot topic issues, guns, immigration, trade, climate change, et cetera. Is this monitoring issues, is this a relatively independent data stream from the candidates' attention, or do you find that there's an interaction between the two?
There's an interaction in the sense that, what does well on social media tends to be the most emotion-driven stuff. With Trump and immigration, it's hard to separate the two, right? Because what he's saying on the campaign, we need to build a wall, they're taking away our jobs. He is intrinsic to that issue. He pretty much created that issue. And, we'll see similar things playing out for this year, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they both proposed cancellation of student debt. Like those stories went really far that we saw in the tracker. Obviously, those are pretty left proposals. So, they go hand in hand in the sense that you associate the issues with the candidate that's really pushing them. Now, something else like climate change, which is shared by many different candidates, I think they all agree, all Democratic candidates agree, like, yeah, this is a major problem. It needs to be solved. Only Jay Inslee, who has since dropped out, was the only one who made it his whole campaign. But we've seen in the tracker that climate change doesn't rank even in the top 5, maybe not even like top 8 of issues going on. So even though people say it's really important, it's important, I think, to show readers, hey, the data and how people are actually interacting with these stories shows that there's not a lot of intense emotion behind it. Is there around climate change? I bet there is, but we're measuring individual stories. And so if you talk about Joe Biden's climate proposal or Beto O'Rourke's climate proposal, those are filled with a lot of granular policy details that, when you push that outside of just climate change as a subject and start to get into concrete, a lot of people tune out because we're talking about like limits on carbon emissions and natural gas and nuclear energy and which kind of forms of alternative energy we're going to get into, and carbon credits. This is stuff that gets down in the weeds that is a lot less emotionally driven than Mexico is invading us and we need to build a wall. That's very concrete. We need to cancel all of student debt. That's very concrete, that's easy to answer, and it is a lot more of a direct injection in the veins of, what gets people animated.
So that's interesting. You have, something like climate change might be a kind of wonky topic that kind of everyone is more or less for on the left, but it's not peaking in terms of attention. What are the issues that are driving the attention tracker up?
If you follow the attention tracker week by week, immigration is always at the top. Pretty much the only exception in recent months was after the shootings in El Paso and Dayton. Then all of a sudden, guns and gun violence became the top issue. And it stayed that way for about 3 weeks and then has started to fall quite a bit after that. And that very much jives with what we've seen in the past around gun violence as well as abortion.
Which are all highly emotional issues.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. But they haven't been able to sustain that interest for an extended period of time. Like all these states started passing abortion laws. They were in the public mind for a while. We saw that move in the tracker. And then people started to forget about it in a way that immigration hasn't. And I think the answer to that is just that Donald Trump is president. So as long as it's his policies and he's pushing his agenda, and we'll continue to talk about immigration, that's the direction that the conversation will move in.
It's interesting. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here from a kind of academic standpoint, thinking about why is it, you have something like guns, highly emotional after these mass shootings. It's almost impossible to sustain that level of emotionality. Like people just get fatigued, I think. And we've seen that looking at when people get really passionate around commenting. There's always a peak. There's a breaking point when people are highly active in commenting and they just get fatigued. And I'm wondering, if something like guns or abortion can't be sustained, why do you think that is? Why is it that immigration is constantly up there? Is it that it's because Trump's promoting it and he's got this pulpit in the rallies, whereas on the left, you have, some candidates like Beto O'Rourke talking more about guns because of, it happened in his hometown. Do you think the competition perhaps from the Democrats, that there's so many issues that they're kind of fighting over, limits, I guess, the lift of certain issues?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I think there's a couple reasons why. One is that, at least for the gun debate, it seems like it's the same exact debate each time the issue comes up. There's a mass shooting. There are a lot of calls for, gun control and gun legislation. Democrats are in favor, Republicans oppose, and then nothing happens, at least while Republicans control government. There aren't that many different directions it can go. I think it's a topic of intense passion, and a lot of people care about the issue, but it almost feels as though, okay, we're going through this same cycle again for every mass shooting, in a way that, just this past weekend, the Odessa shooting happened, and Democrats called for legislation to happen, and Republicans pushed back against it in a way that made me think this is just Groundhog Day from what already happened, not just in Dayton and El Paso, but in the Orlando shooting and the Las Vegas shooting. There's this repetitiveness that I can imagine really brings about a lot of fatigue for people reading about the topic. And then also just the fact that Trump is president. If he is president and he gets to set the agenda and measures that he takes on immigration, he tweets them out. Guess what? That's what the conversation will travel to, because he is the guy in power. He is the guy whose statements make news. So at least while he continues to wield that power, that's what's keeping it at the forefront of the issues being talked about.
Interesting. Let's actually talk a bit about the nuts and bolts of the tracker. I think I have this right. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're looking at a universe of 450,000 verified news domains, and then tracking those articles mentioning candidates and issues, as well as their social media reactions on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah. So how it works, we partner with a company, NewsWhip, who makes this all possible, because what they do is they track how much interaction articles get. And their core business is that they sell this service to publishers like us, so that we can see, what topics are taking off, which stories are spiking, which are trending, and they kind of feed into publishers' decisions. Like, should we cover this story? It seems to be doing well. It's getting a lot of traction.
Just kind of sourcing journalism from social media.
Yeah. But, in thinking about this concept of how can we quantify, the reaction across all of social media and really help readers understand, hey, you have your own feeds, but this is what's going on across the spectrum of all feeds. It seemed like this technology was a perfect way to get that data because you're using real numbers for all stories published. 450,000 domains. That's pretty much covering any mainstream publisher, and then down many different tiers of publishing, so that you can really get a full sense of the universe of social media and how people are reacting to those stories. So then if a story mentions Joe Biden in the headline or in the URL, that will get pulled in for Joe Biden, or same as Andrew Yang. And then when you go to topics like immigration, we obviously use the word immigration to track it, but then we also use a keyword tree of all other related terms: border wall, asylum, migrants, detention camps, so that anything around that issue is pulled into our universe. And then NewsWhip sends us the data each week. It has, when we started to track it in the early spring up until this most recent week, and then we can then translate that into the tracker.
Right. And then looking at the social media reactions, I think Facebook's pretty self-explanatory: likes, reactions, comments. But then for Twitter, you're tracking the dissemination of these articles by 300,000 accounts who, as I read it, tend to be news outlets, journalists, public figures, and celebrities. And so, what's the idea? You're not tracking all retweets, but just those from this 300,000 sort of influencer accounts. And I wanted to ask, what's the idea there? I'm sure that's probably a NewsWhip thing, but does it help limit bots so you only have these verified users, or does it somehow just make the data more interpretable by limiting it down, or what's the idea?
I do think a lot of that comes on the back end and how much can be collected. I think it's a very good proxy because, almost all stories that go far and get a lot of retweets, if they're not originally posted by one of these verified accounts, whether a major news outlet or a reporter from it, it will at least be engaged with by them. And then that will start to trigger them like starting to be tracked. If our goal is to measure the whole universe of social, we'll run into limitations. Like it would also be good to be able to size up like candidates if their name is mentioned not within the confines of a story, but no one has come up with the technology to do that across different platforms as well as track issues. So this is the closest that we are able to get as far as quantifying this whole universe.
Surely. And then there's also the limitations around sentiment, which we've talked about on the show. It's almost, there's no surefire way to measure positive or negative sentiment. We're kind of getting there a bit with machine learning and stuff. But it's important, I think, to note that the attention that you're looking at is non-valenced. It's not positive or negative. It's just kind of the overall number of mentions. And so do you think that that's a limitation, or do you think it's the case that even treating negative coverage as attention is just still a good proxy for how the candidates are performing?
I think both are important. My thought coming in was that negative attention is still very important to factor in, because if we're using the 2016 election as kind of a guide for how to understand this, Trump got a hell of a lot of negative attention. It's not like that started as soon as he became president. So I think what the effect is that people who don't like Trump, yeah, that's a lot of negative interactions and negative shares, but you almost consider that to be somewhat baked in, that the people that don't like him are going to have these like negative sentiment interactions on stories about him. However, the bigger the overall reach is, the more that you'll be able to reach people that might be receptive to him and his ideas. So if you're reaching an audience of 200,000 people on a given story, and you factor in that 50,000 or 100,000 liked him to begin with, 100,000 didn't like him to begin with, you kind of neutral. People are talking to each other and reinforcing their own beliefs. But when you continue to get shared by one side and it's reaching more and more people, you're seeing that the articles and the arguments Trump is putting forth are reaching people he may not have been able to reach in that initial 200,000. So when you're kind of widening that viral bubble, you have an ability to reach, people and potential voters that might turn out for you that didn't already have preformed opinions about you. Now, that's not always the case. Of course, people can also find out about you and have a negative perception about you. But because so much of the results of elections have to do with turnout and enthusiasm, I think that is a pretty important factor to check. But I can't ignore that specifically in a Democratic primary, when it's all about kind of the ups and downs of perception, and is when you have a bunch of candidates to begin with and even 8 top tier candidates and there's a lot of choices, negative perception can definitely have a big impact. So that our most recent edition of the tracker looked at that, kind of stripping away all negative coverage. So stories, kind of if you look at each of the top 8 candidates, the 50 farthest articles about them in the last 4 months, kind of manually stripping out, that's that one's actually supporting another candidate, or this one is a Daily Wire story kind of lampooning the thing they said. Stripping out those, it actually showed that Elizabeth Warren has had the coverage that has gone the farthest, that is positive sentiment. And that's different than had the most positive coverage, because you can have a lot of positive coverage that doesn't go far, but that wouldn't register on these trackers. This is both combining the stories as well as how far they traveled.
Right. That's interesting. I think that, it's because it's always trying to get to this idea. You've been talking a lot about emotion, and the kind of general rule of thumb is that negativity seems to perform better on social media.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you a bit, you kind of touched on it, is about the primary candidates, where it seems if 2016 and this election cycle are any indication, it's just that 20 candidates is now the norm for a primary nomination. And so one of the things that's really a challenge for some of these smaller candidates is just name recognition at the very base. So in that sense, how do you see it? I mean, do you think negativity does have a positive aspect just in terms of getting your name out there if you're a not well-known candidate?
I think it definitely does. It's this interesting dynamic of if you have this situation where Biden is atop of the polling and he's not coming down and there's not much movement, well, you're really incentivized in the debate to go after him, call him out for his record, call him out for the things he said or done. But I think candidates are also being conscious that they don't want to become like a Trump figure or reduce the primary to being all about attacks and being labeled as the bad guy, because that doesn't really help them as much. And certainly if you have more people coming after Biden, then the effect is pretty much diluted. He's maybe hurt a little, but no one else clearly benefits from it.
Because I was thinking about like how the tracker also, so let's say particularly in the first debate when Kamala Harris got a lot of attention after her mention of the busing and everything, how would the tracker actually deal with that? Because if, let's say the headline was like Harris nukes Biden, both get counted, right? Which I guess there is a lot of, they're both getting the attention, but it's really kind of focused on Harris.
Yeah, and we saw in that week when talking about the debates, Kamala had the most from the debates. Worth noting that in that week, Bernie actually had more interactions because of the student debt cancellation plan that he had put forward earlier in the week. But yes, strictly looking at just the debate and what came out of that, Kamala did have the highest interactions number on it, and Biden was just right behind her because any mention of Kamala Harris also had to do with the fact that Biden was the target of that. Your name recognition definitely increases if you attack Biden, because like the second debate had a lot more kind of conflict and disagreement. In the first debate, it was a lot of stump speeches, and then nothing happened. And then Kamala attacked Biden. I was like, oh, wow, the one interesting thing that came out of this was just someone had the brilliant idea to go after Biden and actually cause some drama. So I do think that in the absence of any singular personality like Donald Trump, where just, you're saying controversial things all the time, you need to generate some sort of contrast where you are seen as different from the other candidates that leads to an increase in name recognition. So Kamala did this in the debate. Her polling increased. And then we saw the second debate happen. I thought she did fine, just pretty standard. She got attacked by Tulsi Gabbard in it. And then her polling has kind of fell right back down to where it was before the first debate after that. So it's tough. You need to be able to be in the news, but you also need to be able to kind of sustain it as far as this is who you are, in a way that Trump totally was able to do. Him going after people in the Republican debates wasn't just an anomaly and a one-off strategy. It was kind of who he was.
Right, kind of building this idea of authenticity or, strategic messaging. I want to ask you a bit about how the tracker relates to more traditional indicators of candidate attention, in particular fundraising and polling. So taking fundraising first, do you think the Democratic Party's new fundraising thresholds have given extra, perhaps outsized importance to garnering attention on social media?
Absolutely. There's so few ways that candidates can break out of just the pack. Like we saw in the debates, everyone tried to make themselves into someone memorable, even if they weren't attacking one of the other candidates, that there are just very few levers that you're able to pull. Well, like obviously cable news has huge reach. So if you're talked about on cable news, that matters a lot. If you have kind of an organic social following, that helps. But it can definitely be tough to do, and it kind of takes a moment like Pete Buttigieg had in March and April, where there's just this huge upswell in interest around him following his CNN town hall that led to that. And since then, he's kind of tapered off. So it's really hard to sustain enthusiasm. What we wrote today in a piece was Andrew Yang. If you look at him, he's polling sixth, which is pretty impressive given that he had no national profile coming into the race. And we compared that with the level of coverage he's getting, and it was something like he's had the 13th most articles written about him and the 14th most cable news mentions. So even if you're polling well above what would be expected out of someone with your profile or someone who doesn't come from politics, therefore they're not even being talked about as far as a policy angle as a sitting senator might, it is really tough to break through. And it's kind of his way of doing so has been by going on long form podcasts with Joe Rogan and Sam Harris as a way to get understood. But I almost think like it's leading me to believe that if you are not like a Trump or you're not like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like what can you do if your style is low key, intellectual, well articulated, well thought out? I almost think none of the incentives give a candidate reason to want to, pick the more moderate, level-headed route.
Well, even Buttigieg, who sort of fits that characteristic you just mentioned, kind of low profile, intellectual. But yeah, he was just lifted by the media. I mean, as we saw in the tracker. So I think you could almost, there's obviously differences between the candidates, but you could almost put Yang and Buttigieg, I think, as a style of politics.
Yeah, you're right.
But one has media attention, and the media capitalized on it there. It also drives their revenue a bit.
Yeah, I think like in Buttigieg's rise, there was a lot of newness about the things that he was saying. He has this whole kind of applause line that when I'm kind of 70 something, the same age that the president is now, our climate X and our national discourse Y, and he has an appeal to kind of the Midwest voter. Like, I've won election in Indiana, so this kind of blue collar appeal, yet I am a gay veteran who speaks 8 languages. That kind of all this newness was like, check out this guy. You got it, you understood it, but if he's not continuing to wow you going forward, the numbers just tape off.
Right. So kind of keeping on this idea of fundraising, a lot of that fundraising is being put towards Facebook ad spending. And I know your colleague here at Axios, Sarah Fisher, has shown that the Trump campaign is just outspending all the Democrats by a long shot. Even more than double what Biden is spending. So I'm curious, are you also tracking attention to the Trump campaign as a kind of a benchmark for the Democratic field? Because we've been seeing a lot of comparisons of how much are the Democrats spending. When you can kind of break it down, but then you look at Trump and he's just outspending everybody. So Trump, I would imagine, is getting more attention than everyone as well. Are you looking at that?
Yeah, we're looking at it the way we see it. It's just not a fair fight at this point. There are 20 Democrats right now. So all Democratic voter support, Democratic donor support is being split among these 20 candidates. Once we get closer to primary season and we get closer to there being a Democratic nominee, it will eventually coalesce into one candidate.
Right.
And so everyone will know that donations go to one person. All of the Democratic Party machinery will start to, activate, and those numbers will start to go up for the candidate that's in front. So the way we see it, it's, interesting trend to note, Trump versus all the Democrats individually, but doesn't make for a great apples and orange comparison.
Right. Just because they're so fractured at this point. So then in terms of polling, I think with this tracker, you're getting a sort of metric more or less about candidate success. How successful are they on getting attention in social media? How do you see that metric in relation to traditional polling? You talked a bit about it before with Buttigieg, and we just talked about it a bit with Yang. But, what are you seeing? Because you're watching the polling figures, but you're also watching the attention. What's the kind of relationship?
Yeah, I think what we see is attention being a leading indicator of polling. You start with organic interest. People like what a candidate says. It starts at a pretty low level, but you see like numbers like reach on an article or interactions on an article for what Buttigieg said. And more people start to find out about it, just like the CNN town hall that Buttigieg had. We are learning about this guy, and the first metric you will see is that initial organic stirring. People are starting to feel this way about him, and it's starting to grow and reach more and more people. So then once it starts to infiltrate a good enough portion of the population, then it will get reflected in polling. You've been able to see it reach enough potential voters. Enough people have found out about him that it's reached a critical mass that you can see decimal point increases and then full percent increases for a candidate, that it's kind of your ground zero way to look at where support comes out of.
Particularly, I think, going back to what we were talking about with the way the tracker works with these 300,000 sort of influencers on Twitter, maybe that kind of exacerbates that trend, because it's not like you're just looking at, people with 200 followers retweeting. You're looking at the people with influence online. So when you're seeing them really spreading it on Twitter, that may make the time shorter between the poll numbers moving up.
Yeah. And if you have a lot of people with a small following, like 50 followers tweeting out an article and it gets like very few interactions, you're not able to spread the message or spread the word about the candidate that much. But when you are able to tap into the accounts with the bigger audiences, that's when you can really get it pushed out to more and more potential voters.
Exactly. So what's your actual workflow? Like, how do you get all this raw data from NewsWhip week to week? How do you actually go about interpreting the data meaningfully?
Yeah. So at the start, we took in the data and we saw like who's in front. And when we started to put out the tracker and publish it in June, Biden kind of week after week was getting the most numbers. And that's interesting to tell once you have kind of over a 12-week period, stories about Biden have generated more interactions than anyone else. Then you know kind of that story is set in stone, but there's still so many different angles to come at for future weeks. So the 1 week fluctuations, our chart kind of shows the standings from this past week. Stories about X got the most interactions. And then we link back to all the other editions so you can see like who is tops in other,
Yeah, cool. It's got to build on itself.
Yeah. So, okay, Biden is at the top again. What else is there to know about it? And there are so many other angles that we can come at it with to be able to understand. So what issues are spiking or that people getting animated about? So is it immigration? Well, that's been the status quo. So in the week after the mass shootings, that guns became a major story. That thread was worth pulling out. Or if, 1 week Joe Biden got a lot more interactions than any other candidate. But if you looked at the stories that it was coming from, there were all these negative stories about his gaffes. One of them was him saying that the mass shooting took place in Michigan. And another was him saying that
was it the one where he was saying something about they could be as smart as white kids?
Yes, that's the one. Yes, I've forgotten because there's about 5 that
Too
week.
many gaffes.
But it turns out that all of these stories were negative ones about Biden. So the interactions number looked good for him, but then you start to talk about sentiment. This was not a good week for him at all.
Right.
So what we like to do is we take in the data. And unless the week-to-week changes is something like really notable, we try to look at it from a different angle, whether it's issues or whether it's another trend in the coverage.
Right. So what findings for you have been most surprising or interesting?
Something that's surprised me is that so many of the biggest articles about a candidate have come from conservative publications.
That was mine as well.
Yeah.
When I read through everything, and that was definitely the most interesting. So can you kind of go through that?
So if you were to ask me like ahead of time, like how would this turn out? I would say it'd be a lot of, mainstream publishers that are talking about the candidates, and the candidates that are resonating the most or the ideas that are resonating the most will result in the stories that have gone the farthest. But you have this dynamic going on where like conservative publishers, whether it's the Daily Wire or Breitbart or Fox News, it's them kind of taking what a candidate says or what a candidate does and then publishing that. And then those go the farthest because there's this undercurrent of like, get a load of these radical leftists and the policies they're proposing. So whether it was Cory Booker, like going to the southern border and escorting asylum seekers across, like, can you believe he's helping immigrants illegally come to the U.S.? Or Biden's gaffes, or Bernie, can you look at these like socialist policies? This is not America. That there is such a powerful wave of being against what these candidates are saying that has worked the same way for Trump being in office. Left-leaning publishers, like whether it's HuffPo or Vox or BuzzFeed, so many of the stories that are going far, and we see it because, being in social media and seeing which stories are trending, look at what Trump did today and look at this dumb tweet and he got this fact wrong and that fact wrong. These are the stories that are going really far. So it, stands to reason that when the shoe is on the other foot and Democrats are the ones that, attention is being put on them and scrutiny is applied, the conservative publishers would be able to make a killing on that.
Right. So they're amplifying that content, particularly around gaffes. I can imagine that the right wing, because in this universe of domains you have, this 450,000 domains, these more fringe domains are also counted. So
yeah, and that's important to us. Is like we've been asked before, like, why do you count Breitbart? They're not real news, and I'm like, that's not the point.
Right.
The point is that people are reading it and they're sharing it. Like it's important. The idea is not what we consider to be important fact-based journalism, how far are those stories going?
Right.
The point is to see what is really moving public opinion across the spectrum of social media, whether it's mainstream outlets or far-right fringe companies and what they're writing. If those stories are going far and they're getting a lot of traction, that's interesting and it's moving people's minds and it's shaping opinion and it can have an electoral consequence, and we want to be able to follow that.
Right. Couple last questions for you. I'm interested about if you notice any relationship between the issues or the candidate mentions and the social media reactions. Like, do you notice that those issues or candidates that are getting the most reactions are later being covered more? Like, do you have this bottom-up effect where journalists are seeing what's getting the most attention and then seeing that increase week to week?
I have not seen that play out. What I see more than anything is if you respond to the president, that is going to go far. The week after the mass shootings and Trump said, we got to stop having so many video games, that's contributing to the violence. Direct responses to that generated the most interactions. Some of the proposals from Elizabeth Warren, like wealth tax, it's not like those have continued to pick up steam throughout the campaign as we go on. It happens and people are aware of it, but it's just not something that she is continuing to harp on. You kind of move forward. What's her environmental policy? What's her healthcare policy? What's her guns policy? What's her, childcare policy? And it kind of moves on to different topics in a way that it can really be sustained if you're Trump and you're pushing and you're really fighting for something that can happen at the present time. Therefore, kind of if you look at what stories do the best for candidates outside of their own proposals and the things that they're doing, it's, retorting to the president or saying what he just said is un-American and it's beneath us. It's that kind of rhetoric that we see as going the farthest.
So the Trump effect still lives on in this election cycle.
Yeah, and I think each candidate is trying to establish themselves, not in relation to him,
Mm-hmm.
but if the incentives are that your profile will increase and you'll get a lot more buzz and interactions if you do respond to them, well, guess what? The incentives show that you're likely going to do that.
Yeah, interesting. So my last question has to do with what at least I've been seeing is an increasing prominence of data journalism and computational approaches playing roles in newsroom. So in your experience so far, how do you think these sort of computational data approaches, you're getting this data from NewsWhip, how do you think that benefits journalistic reporting?
I think it's like one of the most important steps that you can take. Of course, I'm biased because I believe in it, but just talking to the press secretary of a campaign or getting the inside information on what policy is about to be proposed, that's helpful and it has its place, but does it really give you a sense of what is actually happening and what's really playing out? Like, it was so annoying to me that after the debates, you have commentators on TV that talk about so-and-so won or so-and-so made an important point that voters will really respond to. You don't know. You can say that based on what you thought, based on all of your prior conceptions and what you think politics is like and what you think people respond to and which arguments you think people, really gets them going, but you don't know. Nobody knows. There's no way to know it. The only way you can know these things is by looking at data. What does the data say? So polling is an important way to do that. Fundraising is an important way to do that. But I think that measuring online interaction is just as important of a measure as well, because you're talking about the biggest platforms that the universe has ever known. The sample size is millions and millions of people that are on Facebook and they're on Twitter. If you're responding to articles and you're able to kind of measure all that is said about a candidate for all the articles written about them, that's, a much bigger sample size than even polling can measure. And, if you consider that interactions happen when people are emotional or hopped up, that's likely to really reflect what they believe, because you share things or like things when you're like, hell yeah, or fuck that. So in that way, I think newsrooms could really benefit from, measuring what we know and not, all these other commentary and opinions for, just trying to guess at different dynamics for what might be going on in the race.
Yeah, and I think it's super interesting that working within the newsroom, you can also see, as you were saying before, you can see what gets attention. You also see it in your own social media reach. And you only kind of get that by having this look on the inside, which I think is super cool that we are here at Axios and doing that. But Neal, this has been super fascinating. Thanks so much for taking the time and coming on the podcast.
This has been awesome. Thank you, Michael.
I've just been speaking with Neal Rothschild, Associate Director of Growth at Axios. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, we'll be keeping the focus on 2020, and I'll be speaking with Chris Dick of Civis Analytics to talk about how data science is being used to increase response rates in the 2020 census. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.